For over 2 decades, Atlas Tech has merged technology with integrity to positively impact our clients, community, and country. And they are committed to serving when and where they can, helping to offset the cost of the great work that key organizations in our community provide. My Sister's House and its work to end domestic violence and support healthy communities is a part of that commitment. Together, we can make positive differences beyond the workplace. Today's podcast is hosted at Borelli Barber in Park Circle, where grooming is craft. Borelli Barber is a premier Charleston barbershop by Peter Evans and Lauren D'Estachio, founded on a belief that you share in your success and support those around you so that they can be successful. They dedicate a part of their practice to benefiting causes both close and around the globe, and we're thankful to be part of their network for this series. Find out more at borellibarber.com. Welcome to Rooted Connections, a podcast by My Sister's House, where we explore how domestic violence is shaping our communities. Each episode, we sit down with journalists, researchers, advocates, and leaders to better understand how our neighborhoods, institutions, and collective voices can break the cycle and build something better. Together, we'll uncover the perceptions that shape our world and the power we have to shift them. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Rooted Connections, a podcast by My Sister's House, where we explore how domestic violence is shaping our communities. I'm Tosha Connors, CEO of My Sister's House, and this series explores the people, data, and community stories shaping safer, more informed futures. Today's episode, Measuring the Silence, What Our Community Really Knows About Domestic Violence, dives into the findings of our recent community survey. We'll look at what people think they know about domestic violence, what the data actually shows, and what that means for prevention, education, and outreach. Before we begin, you might notice that we're recording today's conversation in a barbershop, and that's intentional. Salons and barbershops are often the places where we show up as our full selves, where we talk, where we're vulnerable, and where people notice when something's not quite right. These are also the places where community forms, where people gather, share experiences, and discuss the issues of the day. By bringing these early conversations into spaces like this, we're honoring the everyday environments where trust, connection, and community care begin. Joining me today are 2 guests who bring data and storytelling together in powerful ways. Komlavi Adissem is a public safety reporter with the Post and Courier. Prior to moving to the Lowcountry last year, he studied journalism at the University of Missouri and was a local and state government reporter for the Columbia Missourian. Dr. Shelby Shumard is the Director of Research at the Joseph P. Riley Center for Livable Communities at the College of Charleston. Her research focuses on public policy, program evaluation, state and local governance, and public and nonprofit administration, bringing extensive experience in strategic planning, communications, data analysis, and visualization, and program evaluation. Together, we'll unpack what these findings reveal about our collective understanding and where silence still holds power. By the end of the episode, we hope you'll have a clearer picture of how perception shapes prevention and how each of us can play a role in closing the gap between what we think we know and what's actually happening in our communities. Shelby, thanks for being here. Let's start with a personal question. What drew you to research that deals so closely with the community well-being issues like domestic violence?
Thanks for having me. I first got involved in research and data and trying to understand what works. How can we understand what policies are working, what programs are working, so that we can hopefully help our communities become better places? And so the work at the Riley Center and this work that we've done with My Sister's House is really a part of that. And thinking about how can we understand how people are understanding domestic violence in this case, and how we can think about how we can better support it going forward.
You helped lead the analysis of the survey. Can you walk us through what the team set out to understand and why this kind of data is so important for prevention work in the future?
We sought out to really understand about 4 things. So first, we wanted to understand the prevalence. So how prevalent is domestic violence, or how do people perceive that prevalence more specifically in the community and in this region? The second was really around understanding. What do people think domestic violence means? What types of behaviors are associated with domestic violence? And how we can think about that and people think about that. The next is around personal experience. And so with personal experiences, thinking about how people have personally experienced domestic violence in their lives. And then the final one, which is really important, particularly in this area, is thinking about resources. And that's really thinking about both where are people going to find resources when they have a time of need, but also what are trusted sources that people turn to understand domestic violence better. And so those were kind of the big things we were trying to learn in the community awareness survey.
What were some of the findings that really stood out to you or surprised you?
When we did this survey, we gave people a list of 14 different types of behaviors, and we asked a series of questions about those. And so some of the key findings that we found were that we were surprised that about 12% of individuals and respondents identified none of those behaviors as domestic violence. And these behaviors included both ones that were more less traditional in the sense that they were things like financial or technological abuse, but they also were more traditionally things that we associate with domestic violence, like physical and sexual abuse. And we had about 12% of respondents say that they expected that none of those types of behaviors were domestic violence. And so that was probably a bit higher than we would have expected. One of the other key findings we found was that when we looked at these different types of behaviors, so again, that physical and sexual versus emotional behaviors versus financial and technological behaviors, we found that people saw in their communities the highest prevalence of those kind of financial and technological behaviors, followed by emotional, and then followed by the physical and sexual. But when we asked them about which types of behaviors they associated with domestic violence, we found the inverse relationship. So the ones that were most likely to be associated with domestic violence were those ones that were physical or sexual, followed by emotional, and then the financial and technology. And we thought that was really interesting because that means that the behaviors that people see in their communities are actually the least likely to actually associate with domestic violence. And I think the third kind of key finding that we were surprised by a little bit was the gaps. There was very large gaps that we saw in the types of behaviors that different types of individuals saw as domestic violence. And so we saw large gaps across race, across gender, across income, across education, gaps that were 15% or higher in terms of the number of respondents or the percentage of respondents who were associating specific behaviors with domestic violence. And so those are kind of three different areas that we saw were fairly surprising coming out of the survey, but we thought were interesting.
And finally, from a researcher's perspective, do you think the numbers help tell a human story?
Yeah, at the core, surveys is about perception. So it's about how different individuals in the community view domestic violence, how they understand it, how they hear and perceive that word when they hear it from different people. And so to the extent that that data and the surveys provide insights and provide clues into how people perceive it, it's very human in terms of understanding of our communities, our understanding of the issues that are important to our communities, and how different organizations can really come in and support or address some of the biggest challenges.
Komlavi.
Hi.
Hey. Your reporting often takes complex issues and makes them accessible for everyday readers. What first drew you to covering stories connected to public health, equity, and violence prevention?
I want to start by thanking you for having me, Tosha. I sort of got started in terms of covering issues like public health, safety, and equity and things like that back during my college days working for the Columbia Missourian. One of my favorite sort of series of stories that I did while I was there was covering the upgrades to and concerns about the water treatment plant in Columbia, Missouri, and how the fixes that were being made might not be enough and issues that community members had. And so I have been passionate about issues that affect the public for a while. And I mean, you probably remember last June, you were one of maybe the first people I had interviewed for a story back when I was first writing about cuts to federal VOCA funding, Victims of Crime Act funding. And that is something that when I had learned about it and actually gotten to read about it, read the history of what the act was, what the funding is, and the sort of pervasiveness of domestic violence, that's something that I really sort of sunk my teeth into and found fascinating. And I mean, it's become one of a small number of issues that I've followed as I've continued my work as a reporter.
I do appreciate about your pieces the nuance that you put and the context and the stories, so they don't feel flat when you read them, which I think is very easy to do with other stories that I've read from other reporters. So I appreciate the nuance that you put, especially when you're talking about really serious and traumatic issues like the victims that we're serving in our community. So I do appreciate that.
Thank you.
So when you look at the data, like the findings in our survey, how do you translate numbers into stories that resonate emotionally and inform the public?
I think there's sort of a couple ways that numbers and data can be translated into stories that, someone who might not have any direct experiences with domestic violence might be able to sort of grasp a greater understanding. And I think part of it is on the sort of technical side of things, the use of things like graphics and charts to sort of show visually what it looks like when you say, 12% of folks say that like they don't identify any of these things as domestic violence. 12% may not sound like a lot, but when you multiply that by 100,000 across the city of Charleston or 800,000 over like the metro area, it becomes a significant part of the population. And I think another way that we at the Post and Courier try to do it is to sort of report through example, if that makes sense. There's a project I'm working on now, can't disclose too much about it, but we are sort of choosing example cases and writing about those in an effort to bring attention to a greater issue. And I think that that's something that we have also done, maybe not quite as coordinated as a like project per se, but something we have constantly and steadily done over at least the course of my time reporting for the paper, if not certainly longer, I'm sure, of just finding these tragic cases and being able to report on them, speak with family members, and get a sense of the story to help show that, you could be living in a house on the peninsula, an apartment in Somerville, or a mega mansion out in like Wando or Mount Pleasant, or in a longtime family home in Johns Island. And this is an issue that is everywhere. And I think that through reporting examples, it helps to sort of demonstrate that.
Yeah, that data is really fascinating. And I feel like maybe referencing some of the census data that I barely remember off the top of my head, but like this 800,000, in the Tri-County area. And when we extrapolate some of the data that we have, 1 in 3 or sometimes 1 in 4 women will be victims of domestic violence. And I look at that, I'm like, we've got over 40,000 potential victims in our area, and we're receiving 1,200 crisis calls a year on our hotline, which is a lot for this area. But then I'm thinking about all of those people who aren't calling, and this 12% number that we've been referencing. I'm thinking, if those things don't define domestic violence, do you have a definition for domestic violence? Because that's pretty frightening when we're pulling those numbers out.
Yeah.
And building on that, it was interesting that we had about almost 50% of respondents said they experienced at least one of the behaviors in the survey that are commonly associated with domestic violence. But with so few people associating some of these behaviors with domestic violence, that also kind of builds a bit of the story around how much of an issue this could be and how often we are only scratching the surface.
That's right. A little more of a complex question, I'm sure, to answer, but what responsibilities, Komlavi, do you think journalists have when reporting on domestic violence, whether about specific instances on data to survivors and to the public?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And I've been seeing this a lot in, oddly enough, also immigration, which is something that I've recently covered a lot about. But the two sort of not necessarily competing factors, but two things that are important to keep in mind, at least from my point of view as a reporter, is weighing discretion and someone's right to privacy, which is so incredibly important, with things that are reported in public documents and things that are a matter of public record. And you see this in example, like you can FOIA or ask a police department for a incident report about something that happens. And they often redact and don't disclose names, addresses, things like that, and things we'd never publish anyway. And it's a matter of making sure that we're able to tell someone's story while also not creating a greater harm or posing threats to their safety. And I think a lot of it comes down to sort of trauma-informed reporting in a sense. And I'm sure we'll get to that later in the conversation. But I think it really comes down to sort of weighing that personal privacy with informing the public and doing our duty to make sure that the public knows what's happening.
Yeah. So I love that you said that, trauma-informed reporting. We talk a lot about trauma-informed care at my sister's house. What does trauma-informed reporting mean to you? And is that something you learned in school?
I wouldn't say we specifically learned the term trauma-informed reporting. That's actually something that I think you might have taught me when we first had our first conversation last summer. But it's something that I think really kind of resonated with me that I've been able to practice in multiple areas. To answer your question of what it means to me, I think it's a matter of being compassionate, patient, and understanding. I mean, to use an example from a recent story I covered that's immigration related, like I was speaking with this family and was able to sort of build that sense of trust by not pushing them to do things that they didn't want to do. They didn't want to be on camera in pictures for the story. And I respected that. And it's a matter of listening to concerns about things that might get published, things that might be included in the story. And it's a matter of building trust and having, I'd say, open ears and an open heart, because I mean, one thing that I think might be difficult for journalists is that there's a sort of need to like get everything and get the story and publish by a deadline. But for some situations, and I think DV's included in this, it can definitely be beneficial to sort of take that slower approach to help build that trust, show that you are invested in them as people, and build that relationship and be able to, I think, more fully tell a story as a result. That immigration story that I referenced ran today in the paper. It didn't include a single image of the family, but people still read it. I got lots of positive emails about it. And I think it's just a matter of letting it cook for a bit.
Yeah. I think you're right. There were a lot of parallels between the immigration issues, domestic violence. Trust is paramount in both of those, and respecting the privacy, because we know that might endanger one of our clients further if we don't. So whether it's in research or telling their story, what that looks like, so they feel comfortable coming back to us later and speaking about their issues publicly. I want to bring you both into the next part of this conversation, because this is really where the data and the storytelling meet. Our 2025 Community Awareness Survey was dedicated to understanding community awareness and public perceptions of domestic violence. And while we've already touched on a few themes, I want us to dig a little deeper and discuss what some of the findings mean for awareness, prevention, and community understanding. Our survey revealed some interesting gaps between perception and reality. For example, how many people believe domestic violence is a private issue versus a public one? What do those perception gaps tell us about how we frame this issue publicly?
I noted when you said earlier how a lot of the storytelling is also making people realize that it can happen to a variety of different people, and it goes across different income levels, different genders, different races. And that was one of, I think, also the interesting findings we found in our survey, is that when we asked people about their personal experiences with many of these behaviors, we saw very small differences across many different demographic groups. And so while we did see differences across gender and across age, both men and women, large proportions of them reported having experienced some of these behaviors. And we saw little to no differences across areas like income and race and educational attainment, which essentially is consistent kind of with some of the storytelling that you're saying, that, right? Domestic violence does not discriminate based on demographics. And so the data was very consistent with that story. And one of the areas that we saw, I think that gave a little hope, is that when we asked people some of their perceptions, whether they agreed or disagreed with some of the statements around that domestic violence is more prevalent among lower income or among people of color, that most people disagreed with that statement. And so I think that really is a sign of hope that, you know, people are starting to understand that domestic violence does not discriminate in that way.
I hope that is true. You know, sometimes I really struggle between what the data is showing us and then what we're living out when we're going to different churches in rural communities or healthcare institutions or civic groups, and the responses that the team and I might receive from individuals. You know, we've heard things like, you promote divorce, or that's not happening here in this group, in our neighborhood, at our school. One, we know it is happening there because we're serving these people, and confidentiality is key. So we never share any names or confirm anybody's participation in the program. But we're trying to promote healthy relationships because we believe that everybody deserves to live a life free of violence. And I feel like that can't be stated enough and underscored because it's so important. And when you're looking at that data, Shelby, are there particular misconceptions that stand out, especially persistent or harmful, that you've seen in our community awareness survey?
I think there were kind of two that really came to mind when we were looking at it. One we've touched on, right, is that the idea that we often think that domestic violence and those who are victims of domestic violence have certain types of characteristics. And so I think that the survey and the data that came out of it is really a good source of information that some of those misconceptions and inconsistent with reality. And then I think the other area is the variation in the types of behaviors that are seen as domestic violence. And so well over 50% of respondents identify more physical or sexual behaviors as domestic violence. We see much smaller minorities who identify some of these more emotional or financial or technology behaviors as domestic violence. And so seeing those as different as abusive is something that is not universally held in the community. And so I think thinking about, are there opportunities for organizations like My Sister's Health from an information perspective, and thinking about how domestic violence is defined and how it's understood more generally in the community.
Yeah, and how data is consumed now, right? Like there are all of these different avenues, whether it's a podcast or you're reading traditional media, you're watching something on the news, or there's social media. And just picking out from the data, do you recall, like, as far as the age bands, if there was something specific, like younger, this is an assumption, right, that younger folks might look at technological or financial abuse as domestic violence or abuse because of, you know, maybe what they've seen in a movie or what they've seen on TikTok or whatever other cool app exists out there.
I think one of the interesting findings we had is that actually older respondents were more likely to identify all of the behaviors across all three of the types as domestic violence than some of the younger generations of respondents. And so that was particularly surprising to us especially around some of the areas like financial and technology or emotional that the younger generations just generally seem more likely to talk about. And so we thought that was really interesting that when given those behaviors and seeing those descriptions, that the older generations were actually more likely to identify them as domestic violence than some of the younger generations. And that's looking at kind of that younger generation being that 18 to mid 30s, and then the middle range being kind of that mid 30s to early 60s, and then that older age being kind of that the seniors age. And so the seniors consistently identified more behaviors as domestic violence, which was surprising to us, I think, in the survey, and went against maybe what we had expected prior.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is also off the cuff because I didn't think of this until now, but it would be really fascinating to know how many folks have a therapist or receive mental health counseling, and if that influences how they define domestic violence. Just thinking about these other professionals weighing in and sharing information, and if that would positively impact somebody and how they define or look at domestic violence.
Yeah, I mean, health providers were the number one source where people said that they would turn to when they need information on domestic violence. And so I think the information they're getting from health providers is definitely a key place that people are looking to understand it.
Yeah.
Concept.
This data is going to be really important when we think about how we structure education and training with the resources that we have. Where are we going to be most impactful? What does that look like? And what areas do we need to really target?
Mm-hmm.
Shelby, your work is rooted in using data for impact. How can findings like these inform future outreach or prevention efforts, both locally and statewide?
Mm-hmm. I think in a couple of ways. So first off, when we think about kind of some of these findings and the ways people are understanding domestic violence, I think that has big implications for how we think about public outreach and public information. And so if people are understanding that term so differently, that's an opportunity to think about what are the opportunities to inform people about how this can look very different and how all of the myriad of behaviors that can be associated with domestic violence in these different areas. And then I think one of the other big information that kind of came out of this is where people are looking for information. And so people, unsurprisingly, are often looking at your social media and your traditional media still, but they're also looking at places like their health providers. And so those are opportunities, I think, to think about where the messages are coming out and who is kind of trusted sources that people are looking to for this information.
Mm-hmm. And politicians, I'm excited to use this data to help influence conversations with politicians. Like, we want to be able to give the public the language, the tools, the data to say that they're not just anecdotes that we're hearing, that we have the data to back up what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Komlavi, when you see data like this, what sparks your interest as a reporter? Like, what do you want readers to walk away understanding?
I mean, there's a couple things, honestly.
Tell me.
To begin with, I'm such a policy wonk. I love going through data, numbers, and just like sort of analyzing and putting it all together. So like, I'm very nerdy like that. But
Me too.
but I think in terms of how to sort of put it together and get readers to take something away from it, I would want, I think, readers to walk away having a fuller understanding of, I guess, what domestic violence is. I mean, in the stories I've written, like I said, it's resulted in death in many of the cases, but I mean, every time I check like the jail logs in the morning, there's multiple like lower degree domestic violence arrests. I mean, it's an everyday occurrence. And I think that is important to know. I can't say for certain whether like our readers fully have a thorough understanding of how pervasive it is and then the different sort of aspects that it includes. But I think that is something that I would hope folks would take away from it, because I mean, like you said, Shelby, it's not just the sort of physical things. It can be like withholding funds. It can be like texting people threats, like I've seen in a couple of the cases that I've covered. It can be showing up to people's workplaces, like what happened with Angel Capers and ahead of her death. And it's not a sort of one prong issue. It's like a comb of issues, if you will. There's multiple prongs that are across the board. I mean, since we're in a barber shop, I think an appropriate sort of analogy to use would be like, DV is not a one prong issue. It doesn't happen to one set of people. It doesn't happen in one specific way, but it has so many different prongs that affect various groups of people, various age demographics, racial demographics, and it can manifest in several ways. It's less like a single prong and more like a brush, if you will, to borrow something from our atmosphere that we're in right now.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And we see all of those clients at my sister's house, men, women, across the spectrum. I know there are a lot of folks, they might think that it's not happening in their community because they live in a more affluent community, feels safer, just generally speaking. some of those folks are in a trap. It's just that the trap and that cage is a prettier cage on the outside. And that's really important for people to remember, is that what's going on behind closed doors, we don't know, we don't see. And how somebody acts and behaves at work, or when we're sitting next to them in the pew at church, or, we're going out for happy hour with them, it can be very different when they're at home with their spouse, with their partner. It's really important for people to understand that you're right. Anybody and everybody is impacted and affected by domestic violence. It's not just a women's issue. It is a person issue, that we need men and women to be advocates in this conversation. We can't do it alone at My Sister's House. It's really important that we have the data to back up what's happening, that we have, ethical reporters who are telling the stories and getting the voice out there. So it's something that is happening all around us. It is what our staff is dealing with every single day. And those, 1,200 plus phone calls that we're receiving, we want to be able to say yes to all of the people who are reaching out, and we need other people to support the work and what's happening in our community. All right, I want to pivot a little bit here, and I think this is the perfect segue. In our work, we often find that what's not said can be as telling as what is said. 51% of respondents in our community awareness survey agreed that domestic violence is a prevalent issue in the Tri-County area. That means that 49% of respondents did not agree to the same extent. At My Sister's House, we know that some misconceptions are due to culture of silence across all of our communities. Do you guys believe that there are social or cultural dynamics that keep people, and in particular groups, from acknowledging abuse? Shelby, you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were sharing some of the disparities. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
So research indicates, right, that there are a lot of stigmas around domestic violence that prevent a lot of people from seeing themselves as experiencing domestic violence, and can also shape how they understand what is domestic violence. And so when we think about kind of how that plays out in practice, we did try to structure the survey so that people talked about their experience before they were identifying the behaviors as domestic violence, to try to get a slightly more accurate view into their experience with these behaviors, without having to also claim the title or the everything that comes with saying that you are experiencing domestic violence. But we know that, people have a hard time viewing themselves in that way, and that will affect how they're going to report on something like a survey, and more broadly talk about their experiences. And it'll also probably shape how they define domestic violence, because they are perceiving it through the lens that they want to believe.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. We see a lot of folks who may participate in our support groups for the first time, and they don't say a lot, and you don't have to. So if anybody out there is a victim or survivor and they want to participate in our support groups, they're virtual. So you can call in, or you can choose to show your face on the video or choose not to. And what's fascinating is that oftentimes folks are participating for the first time, and they're just hearing their experiences from the other participants. And it can be really uncomfortable. Like you said, there's that shame and stigma that exists. And then you start hearing your own story reflected in somebody else's narrative, and then it's clicking, and then you don't feel alone. You don't feel crazy. You realize that you've been gaslit by your abuser, and that this isn't safe, this isn't healthy, it's toxic, and this is not normal. So that actually is like one of the first sort of entry points that I recommend to a lot of people. It's just participate in a support group and hear from other people who are going through this, so it can affirm what you're feeling, what's happening. And having that mirror up is a really good way that we've seen with a lot of our clients. But that shame and stigma, it's so deep, where you don't want to be a victim. You don't want to be identified in that way. And when we're giving people the choice, how they want to identify, what part of themselves they're going to show or share with somebody, that part's really important. So thanks for bringing that up. Komlavi, we know that the media plays such a powerful role in defining public understanding, for better or for worse. I want to circle back to how you described your education and training. What does responsible trauma-informed reporting look like in practice?
I mean, we did touch on it earlier. I think it's a matter of being able to, I'd say, start off by approaching someone whose story you want to tell by saying, hi, like, I'm Komlavi, I'm a reporter with so-and-so, I'd be interested in telling your story, but I want to sit down with you and get to understand who you are, what happens, and I want to fully understand your story so I can tell it in the most accurate and honest way I can. And I think it's a matter of having that interpersonal sort of introduction, having a sort of sit-down conversation to build trust and show compassion to someone. And I think that goes a long way in being able to tell a complete, or as complete as we can get, story. And it's also about, like we talked about earlier, balancing the sort of public right to know, the public duty of reporting with someone's privacy and things that they might not be comfortable with, whether it be being on camera for an interview or having photos taken of them or using or mentioning their occupation or where they work, things like that. The sense of embarrassment and taboo runs deep. And so there might be some things that they aren't comfortable with, like they might not want folks at work to know. And so it's a matter of listening to that in addition to listening to the story that they're telling that you hope to tell through the newspaper, and sort of just making sure that you keep them too in the loop as your story progresses. I mean, I think back again to the immigration story I recently did, just because it's so fresh in my mind. And a big part of that was keeping the family in the loop so that they knew when it was going to run, if there were any sort of topics that might be a bit uncomfortable. I wanted to address it frankly with them to see, hey, are you comfortable with this? Do we need to maybe explain something in a different way? It's ultimately about, and this I did learn in J school, journalism school for folks not in the know. J school, yes. There's a duty for journalists not to create or inflict harm. That, I mean, it's much like doctors. You're
have
trying
your own Hippocratic oath, huh?
Yes. There is a journalistic creed, or a reporter's creed. I forget what it's exactly called. My professors are probably gonna sigh if they listen to this.
They're gonna give you some feedback on that.
They will.
They're gonna get your email.
Certainly. But it's a matter of not doing more harm than has already been done to someone in a vulnerable position like this. And I mean, there's many people who we cover their cases and they don't want to share their experience at that time, and we respect that. And it's also an instance of sort of respecting people's boundaries ultimately, which I think is something that everybody can relate to and empathize with in that way.
Yeah. I think it's incredible when media outlets decide to be courageous enough to report on topics that are taboo in the community. And so as we're honoring the 10-year sort of anniversary of the Till Death Do Us Part series, is there anything that you think would be a really good extension of that story? Or has there been reader feedback wow, it'd be great if the data, is showing us these things. What might an extension of that story look like for our community?
I think an extension of the Till Death Do Us Part series that we did 10 years ago would be, I think the natural way to follow it up would be a sort of where are we now? And that would definitely include the data showing we had this comeuppance, we had this sort of reckoning 10 years ago. What has changed? What remains? And what are we seeing in the numbers? What are we hearing in the community? And I think that is a way to follow up that in a way that makes sense and in a way that sort of reflects, but also maybe pushes forward on the issue as well.
Yeah. You know what I love about the data is, one, that we have data because in our field, there's a lack of data, and the data that does exist, it is often incredibly outdated. You know, like that was 10 years ago or even 20 years ago that people reference. So our sort of internal mandate at my sister's house, and this is where we give the board a lot of credit for saying that this is important. If we're going to make these strategic decisions moving forward and we want to have a really strong impact on the community, we need good data. And that's why it is incredible to have these years sort of building up with our client needs assessment and this community awareness data here. So Shelby, from your side, how can researchers and journalists collaborate to make complex data accessible without losing nuance?
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the most difficult things with data is the ability to use data to tell stories, but to also understand the limitations and the challenges with data and everything. And so I think part of it is making clear, right, what are our limitations, but also, right, a survey is never going to capture every single nuance or every single perspective, but it provides us information and it tells us about how people are seeing their communities and how they're viewing their space around them. And so I love being able to use data to tell stories. I think being able to pull out what are kind of the surprising points, taking opportunities like this where we can dive into the data a little bit more and give people different opportunities or different ways of engaging with it. But also we've done a lot of effort when we worked with my sister's house to try to also highlight some of the big takeaways. What are the things that surprised us and surprised you all having been in this space a bit longer? And what are kind of the big things that you would want someone to take away with? And I think those are ways in which we can use data responsibly, but also help people understand these are the things that we think are important to know.
And that, just to go back, that 12% that we were talking about, some of those things, they're still a little shocking to see on our side. But what we also see is that when folks have been in generational cycles of violence and trauma, it is so normalized. So those things aren't domestic violence. That's just part of a relationship. Mm-hmm. And I want that to really sink in for the folks who are watching and listening, that sometimes it is so normalized that this physical violence that we typically think about being punched or slapped is part of a relationship that some people expect. And that is not a healthy, normal part of a relationship that anybody should expect. Mm-hmm. This has been such an important and layered conversation about perception, truth, and the work still ahead. But before we wrap up, I want to bring us back to the community level. Where do we go from here? As researchers, as reporters, as everyday citizens? Mm-hmm. And that's a real question. I want you to tell me. Where do we go? What do we do? There's so much. Sometimes it feels so heavy on this side. So we need the smart, important voices. Guide us, lead us. Where do we go?
I'd say it starts with just informing people. And I mean, that's something that we did back in 2015 with Till Death Do Us Part. It's something we continue to try and do, something that I in particular have done quite a bit of over the past year and a half or so with the Post and Courier, whether it's issues like funding for crisis centers and shelters, or if it's specific cases of DV. These things need to be out there in the public ether before people can ask for change from their policymakers, or policymakers can read something and say, hey, we need to do something about this. So I think it starts with sort of using that trauma-informed approach to tell stories that get the word out there, and to also bring in the data and show that this is something that isn't like one specific thing or in one specific place, that it really does sort of permeate and have its like hands everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to that end, both of you sort of sit in this critical intersection between knowledge and action. So, Shelby, what needs to happen next for data like this to do something to inspire real community change?
So first off, I think opportunities like this where we can have people who are kind of more in the data and people who are telling stories, I think having both sides of that is so powerful because we can bring the data to show that, hey, this is widespread, or we can get a bigger sample to understand the extent to which the stories are not just one-off. But being able to put human faces and human stories to these, I think makes people relate to them. They understand it, they can see it more. And so I think opportunities like this where you can engage in storytelling around the data and around kind of personal stories is such a great opportunity. I think it's also organizations, I hope, that work in this space that you all partner with will be able to use this data to see kind of what is the current status quo? Where are people coming from? Where are there the opportunities to grow or to dig in a little bit deeper? And where are maybe the best options to be able to be doing that? And so I think hopefully the data can help provide some clues in that direction. And I hope down the road that there's also opportunities to continue to build this, to see how this changes in a few years. Where are we seeing growth? Where are we seeing continued opportunities to do more? And I think being able to use that information, as I said earlier, a survey is never going to tell us everything we want to know, but it can provide some clues. And so I think there's some nuggets that different organizations may take out of this survey that can kind of help inform where there are opportunities to go forward.
Look, I've never been a true data person. It's not my nature, but I've learned to become a lover of data. Mm-hmm. So I really want to thank both of you for this conversation. It was exciting, and I don't often say that about data. So Shelby and Komlavi, thanks for sharing your insight and your commitment to truth-telling and community well-being. And thank you all for listening and for being part of our community and helping us build a new foundation of understanding for everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Rooted Connections. If something you heard today made you think differently, we hope you'll carry that reflection into your conversations, your community, and your choices. To explore the research and topic we discussed today, check the show notes for links and resources, along with local and national resources if you're seeking support. You can learn more about our work at mysistershouse.org, where we continue the mission to fight for more survivors and work toward a world where safety and healing are a human right. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow Rooted Connections wherever you listen to your podcast, and continue to join us this month as we explore how communities come together to create safety, awareness, and hope. Until next time, stay rooted, stay connected.